let me all welcome you to the second day of our digital theme week on degrowth, South and North, where we focus on the potential of plannable, democratic and peaceful transitions out of a growth-oriented economy. Indeed, not just in the recent years, it has become clear that this kind of growth-fixed economy has become a problem for people as well as for nature. On yesterday's first day, we already discussed with Vandana Shiva about how she called it the strange beast called growth, and about why the growth myth is so productive and in which ways it turns nature into a commodity and much more. So, but before we get into today's topic, a few words about what we are doing here in Hamburg, especially for those who couldn't attend yesterday. My name is Sarah Lenz, and together with Philipp Degens and Frank Adloff, I organized these lectures, this theme week. We are part of the Center of Advanced Studies for the Futures of Sustainability, which opened in 2019 and is funded by the German Research Foundation. Our work here at the center focuses on the different objectives and visions of the future that are associated with sustainability as a guiding concept for social and ecological change. In all our different research projects, we take a reflexive perspective that does not refer to sustainability as a per se desirable normative idea. Rather, we assume that the concept of sustainability is highly open to interpretation and has different implications in different contexts. We see that sustainability is interpreted differently by actors, organizations, and even states. And this openness of the concept of sustainability for different imaginations and practices is reflected in the notion of contested futures of sustainability, whose diverse, sometimes conflicting tendencies describe different potential trajectories of social and ecological change. We observe three trajectories that societies could follow in striving for sustainability, namely modernization, transformation, and control. And as I mentioned, these visions of the future do not necessarily complement each other, rather they often conflict with each other. For example, green modernization or green growth leaves capitalist structures untouched, while transformation refers to a broader fundamental shift away from existing growth-oriented institutions. Politics of control invoke an ecological emergency to enforce resilience measures, while at the same time suspending civic rights. In concrete terms, modernization, transformation, and control do not refer to developments that are already fixed, but rather indicate which imaginaries of the future are currently in conflict. So the degrowth idea, the central subject of our theme week, is one of these conflicted ideas and one possible trajectory of sustainable and more just future. As a leading critique of growth, however, degrowth goes well beyond a purely economic concept of transformation, offering a vision of a different society. A society that renounces growth would have to be based on completely different economic and social, cultural, and political conditions. According to the degrowth perspective, however, it is not at all sufficient to limit only bad growth like diesel cars or toxic finance, and to promote good growth, for example, green energy. What is needed is a completely different culture that legitimizes less production and consumption. In a nutshell, a different culture that is rooted in the people's lifestyles themselves. However, that is not enough, as Jason Hickel has recently argued and will, I guess, certainly argue today. A transformation is about establishing fundamental anti-colonial principles to enable this transformation. Ultimately, a radical break with the logic of growth means first decolonization, which is one of the most important preconditions for successful development in the South. Well, let's now turn to our today's speaker. It is a pleasure and we are honored to welcome Jason Hickel to our Digital Theme Week. He is one of the key references when it comes to the political economy and political ecology of degrowth. As an economic anthropologist and professor at the Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, he holds several fellowships and is involved in a variety of advisory boards and committees, for example, the journal World Development or the advisory board of the Green New Deal for Europe. His research focus is just as broadly positioned as he focuses on global inequality, political economy, post-development, and ecological economics. In an incredible number of publications in journals, edited volumes, magazines, newspapers, and books, he explores these perspectives, and I just want to pick out some of them. First, in a paper in New Political Economy last year, together with Jason, together with Giorgio Kallis, took a critical look at the so-called green growth. Hickel and Kallis look deeper into the assumption of national and international policy that green growth leads to sustained economic expansion and is at the same time compatible with the ecology of the planet. Hickel and Kallis find no evidence for that assumptions. Moreover, they note it is highly unlikely, even under optimistic political conditions, that absolute decoupling from carbon emissions will be achieved fast enough to prevent global warming above 1.5 or 2 degrees. Then I would like to mention his two most recent books. And the first is The Divide, a brief guide to global inequality and its solutions, published by Penguin in 2017. And the 2020 published a book on Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, which is listed by the Financial Times and New Scientists as among the best books of the year. Among his central points he makes in Less is More is that inequality is one of the most intentional byproducts of capital expansion and one of the most insurmountable that will have to be addressed. Growing inequality is one of the most important problems to be solved by, among others, by reducing the incomes of the very rich. This kind of justice will just have a positive effect on ecological and climate crisis. But now I will stop and hand over to Jason. We are very excited about your talk on imperialism and degrowth imperative. The floor is yours, Jason.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate the introduction. So just give me a second to share my screen, if that's all right. Is that visible to everybody? Yes, okay. Okay. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to do, I'm going to assume that most of you have at least some passing familiarity with degrowth arguments and scholarship. So I'm going to devote my time here instead to describing the colonial dimensions of the world capitalist system and the ecological crisis that it is causing, and then discussing the anti-colonial dimensions of degrowth theory and policy. So I'm going to argue that addressing the crisis of ecological breakdown, and moreover doing it in a way that is socially just, requires degrowth in the rich countries of the global north. Okay. Right, so I want to start by setting out a little bit where we're at with respect to the most prominent dimension of the ecological crisis, which is climate breakdown. What I want to do here is I want to frame the concerns that I have about the world economy with respect to what's happening ecologically. So right now we are presently at 1.1 degrees of global warming. And of course, even at this level, the effects are already disastrous. Our media tend to focus mostly on damages that occur in the global north, but in fact, the vast majority of the impact is being inflicted on the global south. And this is very important for our analysis here. So I want to highlight that a little bit. We all know that the world is experiencing rising incidents of extreme storms. In Mozambique, the country's second largest city was literally flattened by a massive cyclone in 2019. Puerto Rico, as we know, was destroyed by Hurricane Maria in 2017 and is still to this day in the process of recovery. We are seeing more serious heat waves. Heat waves in India and Pakistan, for example, routinely kill hundreds of people a year. And in 2015, a single heat event killed several thousand. We're seeing more extreme droughts, with droughts in Northeast Africa and Central America, in certain regions, totally destroying the possibility of agriculture, forcing people to migrate to more habitable parts of the region. And then, of course, there are the wildfires. We all know the infernos that have blazed across California and Australia, but the fires that have scorched the rainforests of Brazil and Indonesia are equally devastating, if not more so, in scale. All told, according to the most recent data that we have, some 30 million people are being displaced by climate breakdown every year, which is triggering major social and political upheaval. For these people, climate apocalypse isn't some abstract future possibility, it's already here. Okay, so now we know that in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, as per the Paris Agreement, global emissions have to be cut in half by 2030. And that's represented here by the green line in this graph, which is declining, as you can see, dramatically from historical trends represented in the black line. But so far, government pledges are nowhere near achieving this target. And in fact, most people are not aware of this issue, but even if all countries uphold their pledges under the Paris agreements, global emissions will not decline at all over the coming decade. And that reality is represented here by the blue line in this graph. And by the way, this image accounts for new pledges that were made in Glasgow recently. Moreover, right now, existing government policies have us on track for at least 2.7 degrees of global heating, which is significantly over the target. And that figure actually includes assumptions about negative emissions technologies that are likely to not be valid. So it's probably an underestimate by a little bit, at least. And this represents really a dramatic failure of our governments and of our international system, and portends a very dangerous future indeed. So what will the world look like as we start to approach 3 degrees? Just very briefly, I'm going to give an overview of some of the existing scientific modeling on this, okay? So we know that sea levels are projected to rise by 1 to 2 meters, which will of course swamp many coastal regions and coastal cities and significantly exacerbate coastal storm damage. Some 30 to 50% of the species on our planet will be wiped out in a 3-degree world. And I don't know about you, but every time I encounter this figure, I find it almost too horrifying to contemplate. More than 1.5 billion people will be displaced from their homes by climate impacts, triggering mass migration on a scale that dwarfs anything we've yet witnessed as people flee the impacts of climate change in various registers. And the yields of staple food crops will decline significantly to the point where the United Nations now warns of what they refer to as multi-breadbasket failure and sustained food supply disruptions globally, with famines potentially affecting several regions at once. So this is why Kevin Anderson, who's one of the leading climate scientists in the UK, routinely says that a 3 degrees world is not compatible with organized human civilization as we know it. And yet this is the reality that we face. This is effectively the future that we are headed toward without a dramatic change in direction. Now, we have a tendency to refer to this crisis using the language of the Anthropocene. And of course, this terminology is useful to highlight the fact that for the first time in geological history, human activity is dramatically reshaping our planet and our climates. But this terminology is also incorrect. It's not humans as such that are causing this problem, which is what is implied by the term. Rather, it's being driven by our economic system, namely capitalism, and is caused almost entirely by a small number of rich countries in the global north, primarily to the benefit of their elites and corporations. Okay, now this is perhaps clearest when it comes to the question of emissions. The countries of the global north are responsible for the vast majority of the excess emissions that are causing climate breakdown. And we can measure this by taking the safe planetary boundary, which is 350 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, dividing it in an equitable way across the global population, and then determining which countries are responsible for basically overshooting their fair share of that boundary. We did this in a recent article for the light here in this graph. And what is 40% of excess emissions, existing damages caused by climate breakdown all around the world. The global north as a group, which includes the USA, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, which is represented here in dark green, is responsible for 92% of global excess emissions. Meanwhile, the entire continents of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which are home to the vast majority of the world's population, are responsible for only 8% of excess emissions. That's represented here in the light green in this graph. And most of the countries in the global south, including large populous nations like India, Indonesia, and Nigeria, are still well within their fair share of the planetary boundary and have therefore not contributed to the problem at all. So I argue that it's imperative that we understand this reality as a process of atmospheric colonization. The atmosphere is a shared commons on which all of us depend for our existence. And rich countries have effectively appropriated it for their own enrichment, while with devastating consequences for the rest of the world and for all of life on Earth. Meanwhile, the global south, which has done very little to cause this problem, suffers 82 to 92% of all of the economic costs and damages inflicted by climate breakdown, and suffers 98 to 99% of all climate-related deaths. In other words, virtually all climate-related mortality is sustained in the territories of the global south. So in sum, it would be sort of difficult to sort of overstate the scale of the injustice that's represented in this dynamic. Okay. Now, we can see this inverse relationship between cause and effect very clearly if we look at a map showing which countries are the most responsible for excess emissions, and then compare this to a map showing which countries are most vulnerable to climate impacts. So the red nations in this map are those that have contributed most to causing climate breakdown. And as you can see, of course, it's overwhelmingly the countries of the global north. And in this second map, the red nations are the ones that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate breakdown. And as you can see, it's overwhelmingly the countries of the global south that are affected in terms of multidimensional climate vulnerability. Indeed, the two maps are almost exact inversions of one another. So in other words, it's not only that climate breakdown is being driven by processes of atmospheric colonization, it's also that the consequences are playing out along colonial lines. So if we're not attentive to the obvious colonial dimensions of the climate crisis, then we're clearly missing the point. I also want to show you just very briefly this map. This comes from a recent paper in the journal Nature Climate Change. And it shows the geographical distribution of deadly climate conditions at 2 to 3 degrees of global warming. The yellow regions here will experience around 100 days of deadly heat per year, okay? And the red regions will experience around 300 days of deadly heat. So as you can see, much of the global south will be plunged into conditions so extreme as to render whole parts of the tropics basically uninhabitable for humans. So for these regions, 2.7 degrees, which again is the trajectory we're headed on, is literally a death sentence. And this is where we're headed without a dramatic change in direction. So in light of these realities, it's clear that rich nations' targets to decarbonize by 2050 are woefully inadequate. Remember, achieving zero emissions by 2050 is a global average target to keep temperatures under 1.5 degrees. Given their disproportionate contributions to excess emissions, rich countries have a responsibility, even under the Paris Agreement, to decarbonize much faster than this, to give poorer nations more time to transition. So what this means is that every additional ton of CO2 that rich countries emit represents more atmospheric colonization. Therefore, pledges for zero by 2050 are in effect pledges to continue colonizing the atmospheric commons for another 30 years. This is a slap in the face of the global south, a violation of basic climate justice principles, and it's unacceptable. We should be calling on our leaders to take much more dramatic action. Now, crucially, climate change is not the only crisis that we face. This reality tends to fall out of our media discourse, but it's quite important to recognize. The global economy is presently overshooting several other planetary boundaries, including, as represented here in the planetary boundary framework, land system change, by which we mean deforestation and habitat destruction, mostly for industrial monoculture and mining, biogeochemical flows up at the bottom there, which is fertilizer from industrial agriculture, mostly for industrial meat production, which to soils and systems. Extinction, which is right now 1,000 times faster than that prevailed prior to the Industrial Revolution. And novel entities at the top there. These are basically industrial chemicals and plastics that are being produced and wasted at a rate that exceeds the capacity of our planet to safely absorb. Now, this overshoot is being driven overwhelmingly by excess material resource use in the world economy. In other words, all of the material stuff that the global economy extracts and produces and consumes every year. I want to show you what this looks like with this graph of global resource use over the past half century. This metric adds up the total weight of metals, cement, forests, fish, fossil fuels, everything, all of the material resources that the economy extracts and uses every year. The red line in the graph is what industrial ecologists say is the maximum sustainable boundary. That's 50 billion tons per year as kind of a maximum corridor. As you can see, we shot past that threshold in the late 1990s. And crucially, resource use is in turn being driven by our pursuit of economic growth. There's a very tight coupling between GDP and material flows. For the past half century, economists have promised that more efficient technology and a shift towards services would decouple growth from resource use, but in fact, the opposite has happened. Over the past 2 decades, in fact, a recoupling has occurred. The global economy is becoming more resource intensive, not less. And as of 2020, we're now consuming 100 billion tons of resources per year, thus overshooting the maximum boundary by a factor of 2. This graph, by the way, shows global GDP and global resource use since 1990, indexed to 1990, okay? And here again, it's crucial to observe that rich countries are overwhelmingly responsible for causing this problem. And this is clear when we look at this graph, right, which shows per capita resource use by country income group. Again, the red line here is the maximum sustainable threshold. And we see that rich countries on the far right consume on average 28 tons of resources per person per year, which is 4 times over the maximum boundary. And by the way, vastly in excess, and this is important, vastly in excess of what is required to meet human needs, even at a high standard. Now, crucially, I should say that not all residents of rich countries are responsible for this. Richer individuals consume much more than working class people, clearly. But more importantly, these high levels of resource use are the effects of an economic system that is organized around commodification and growth rather than around meeting human needs, okay? Which is why even in countries like the USA, these high levels of resource use still leave people in poverty, unable to meet basic needs for decent housing and healthcare, right? Meanwhile, lower income countries consume a small fraction of this amount and remain well within sustainable levels. In fact, in most cases, they actually need to increase their resource use in order to build the infrastructure necessary for human development, things like hospitals and schools and so on. So this is important. If all countries were to consume like rich nations do, we would need the equivalent of 4 planets to sustain us. This is clearly not a tenable proposition, okay, for the future. On the other hand, if rich countries consumed closer to the global, the average of the rest of the world, we would not at present be in a condition of global ecological breakdown at all. Let that fact sink in. It's quite an extraordinary one. And here too, I want to emphasize that excess resource use in the rich nations represents a process of colonization. And this is where things to me get quite interesting. And let me just take a minute to explain how this works. Here's the key facts. Growth in the global north relies on a massive net appropriation of resources from the global south. In fact, more than half of the excess resource use in the global north is net appropriated from the global south. Okay, so that's net of trade. This should come as a little surprise to anyone who pays attention to where our products are actually produced. Our clothes, our smartphones, our bananas and coffee and tea, which we have every day, all of this is produced in the global south with Southern resources and Southern labor. Just to give you a sense for what this looks like, this graph here from a recent paper of ours that's coming out shows asymmetrical trade flows of material resources between the global north and the global south over time. The light gray at the top represents Southern imports, while the dark gray at the bottom shows Southern exports. So what this translates into is a massive outward net flow. And remember, this is actually not just primary commodities. Most of these resources are embodied in manufactured goods, right? Which is the structure of the world economy today, is that most of this manufacturing actually happens in the global south. So this graph over here shows the exchange of labor embodied in trade. And here again, we can see that there's a huge net flow of embodied labor from south to north, right? The south exports a tremendous quantity of embodied labor embodied in traded goods, which gets consumed in the north and imports a very small quantity back from the north. So what this means effectively is that the social and ecological impacts of northern growth and consumption or externalized to the global south. That is where the damage happens, at the resource frontiers, at the labor frontiers. Southern ecosystems and communities are effectively being plundered to support continued growth in the global north. Okay. So in this recent paper, we've calculated the full scale of net appropriation from the global south in empirical terms. And the results are actually quite staggering. Let me give you a sense briefly for what they look like. We find that a net total of 12 billion tons of embodied raw materials is appropriated from the south each year. And again, by embodied here, I mean materials that are involved in the production of traded goods. This figure in perspective, 12 billion tons is double the total mass of resources extracted from the continent of Africa each year, right? So this is transferred to the north for free without any equivalent compensation, okay? 21 exajoules of embodied energy is net appropriated from the south each year. To put this figure in perspective, that amount of energy would be enough to bring the entire population of the global south up to a level of energy use sufficient to meet human needs at a high standard, right? But instead it is used to fuel growth in the global north, okay? 820 million hectares of embodied land is net appropriated from the global south each year. To put this in perspective, that's twice the size of the Indian landmass. So that amount of land could be used to provide nutritious food for 4 to 6 billion people. But instead it is used to produce things like sugar for Coca-Cola and beef for McDonald's, consumed in the global north. And finally, 188 million person years of embodied labor is net appropriated from the global south each year. That's equivalent to the size of Latin America's entire workforce. So imagine a standing army the size of Latin America's workforce that could be used to staff hospitals and schools and build houses in the global south. But instead is recruited to work full-time year after year, churning out tech gadgets and fast fashion for northern corporations, right? Now, this is not a small thing. These are significant numbers. Our results show that growth in the global north depends not marginally, but utterly on this imperialist appropriation. It literally depends on sucking the life out of ecosystems and human communities in the global South. And this is the cause not only of environmental degradation, but also of mass poverty and human deprivation in the global South. For instance, the value appropriated from the South each year is enough to end global poverty 70 times over, right? But instead, the South is maintained in conditions of misery in order to shore up the possibility of capitalist growth in the North. In other words, the dual crisis of ecological breakdown and mass poverty is an effect of the imperialist world economy. Now, what I want to argue is that imperialist appropriation along these lines is a structurally necessary feature of capitalist growth, not an accident. And here's the key thing to understand. Under capitalism, growth is not about increasing production to meet human needs. It is about increasing production in order to generate and accumulate surplus value, okay? That is the sole objective. And this is important because people have a tendency to think of capitalism as simply a system of markets and trade. But of course, importantly, markets and trade existed for thousands of years before capitalism. So what makes capitalism distinctive is simply that it is organized around perpetual expansion for the sake of perpetual accumulation. And in order to sustain perpetual surplus accumulation, capital requires input prices to be as low as possible. To achieve this, capital has to find ways of cheapening labor and resources, okay? Now, of course, one option is to sabotage your domestic resource base and your domestic working class by cutting protections on labor and the environment and so on. But of course, this hurts people. And sooner or later, you're likely to face some kind of rebellion, a revolution perhaps. If you want to avoid this outcome, and indeed, if you're under pressure from your working class to improve the conditions of the working class, then your only other option for maintaining accumulation is to sabotage some third party who is not in a position to fight back. And this is where the colonies come in. Capitalism has relied on forms of colonization for the entirety of its 500-year history in order to keep input prices as low as possible. Imperialism is therefore a structurally necessary feature of capitalist growth. This arrangement was obvious, of course, during the colonial period from 1492 onward. Capitalism in Western Europe clearly relied, and again, utterly, on the appropriation and on the use of enslaved and indentured labor on a truly vast scale. I'm not going to take time to spell that out here, but let it suffice to call to mind the silver plundered from the Andes, the sugar and cotton grown on land appropriated from indigenous Americans, and the grain, rubber, gold, and countless other resources appropriated from Asia and Africa. This global network of extractive industries enabled the economic rise of the imperialist states and began the process of ecological breakdown that continues to this day. Now, this arrangement came under threat in the middle of the 20th century with the rise of the radical anti-colonial movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Newly independent governments refused to be plundered by Northern capital and pursued instead strategies of economic sovereignty, reclaiming their resources to focus on meeting domestic human needs. Toward this end, they used tariffs and capital controls to protect their markets. They used subsidies to protect and support domestic industries. They used land reform to shift land away from foreign companies towards small farmers. And they ensured better wages for their workers. This approach succeeded marvelously at raising incomes and improving welfare in the global South. But Northern powers were, of course, not pleased, as these progressive policies were cutting off their access to cheap labor and raw materials in the global South, which they had enjoyed, of course, and relied upon under the colonial period. In other words, the progressive movement caused the colonial arrangement to unravel, and this triggered a massive crisis of capitalism in the 1970s. As it turns out, capitalism cannot abide conditions of global justice, okay? The imperialist states were scrambling for a way to respond to this crisis. And they did so first by intervening militarily to depose anti-colonial leaders. including figures like Salvador Allende in Chile, Sukarno in Indonesia, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Arbenz in Guatemala, Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, and many others who were unseated by Western-backed coups and replaced with dictators more amenable to Western economic interests. But they also, and more importantly, used the World Bank and the IMF to impose neoliberal structural adjustment programs across the Global South in the 1980s and 1990s. Structural adjustment programs forced governments in the South to cut tariffs and subsidies, cut protections on labor and the environment, cut public spending, and cut public sector employments. This destroyed their economic sovereignty and pushed the prices of labor and resources back down. And again, we have empirical evidence of this. So structural adjustment therefore restored the colonial arrangement and rescued capital accumulation in the global North. Now, here's the thing. By depressing prices in the global South, this means that for every unit of resources and labor that the South imports from the North, they have to export many more units to pay for it. And this is what we refer to as unequal exchange, and it generates the large net flows of resources from South to North that I described earlier. So this is the form that imperialism takes in the 21st century, okay? Effectively depressing the prices of Southern workers and suppliers through global commodity chains and in international trade. This is an arrangement that enables imperial appropriation without the need, in most cases, for military occupation. Now, I want to take a moment to underline a key conclusion that emerges from this research. Orthodox economists believe that the world's countries are all on the same general trajectory of developments. They're just at different stages. They believe that the poor countries of the global South will be able to follow the same development trajectory as the US and Europe, and therefore eventually catch up to them. But once we understand that growth in the global North depends on imperialist appropriation, this narrative is revealed to be absurd. Sorry, are you all seeing a feedback of my video in the slides? No. No. Is that correct? Okay, fine. So in reality, catch-up developments cannot occur within a system that is predicated on imperialist appropriation. It cannot occur in the context of net South-North flows. And it cannot occur within a system that relies on cheapening Southern labor and resources. Saying that poor countries can catch up to rich ones in this context makes about as much sense as saying that Amazon workers can catch up with Jeff Bezos if they just work hard enough. It's clearly not possible, given that Jeff Bezos's income obviously relies on appropriation from Amazon workers. So this is why we see that the income gap between the global South and the global North has continued to increase since the end of colonialism, as we see in this graph. Global North on the top, obviously, and global South on the bottom in terms of constant GDP per capita. There is no catch-up development happening. And this is not because poor countries are somehow behind in developments. It is because they are exploited. Development occurs only to the extent that countries manage to achieve some degree of economic sovereignty, okay? Okay, so what needs to happen? Clearly, our response must be commensurate to these realities. Let me try to break down what is required a little bit. The first thing is that rich countries need to dramatically scale down their use of the planet's resources. And I mean this very literally, quite dramatically, specifically by around 75% from existing levels. Now, the existing dominant discourse claims that resource use can be reduced through green growth. And the idea is that efficiency improvements will allow us to achieve an absolute decoupling of GDP from resource use, so that GDP can rise indefinitely even while resource use declines. Now, this sounds wonderful, of course. The only problem is that scientists reject this narrative as empirically baseless. GDP growth remains tightly coupled to resource use, despite dramatic improvements in efficiency and technology over the past several decades. There is no evidence of absolute decoupling, and all existing models project that it is unlikely to be achieved in the future, even under highly optimistic assumptions about efficiency and technological change. And these results have been, by the way, confirmed by scientists several times over the past few years. The main reason for this is that in growth-focused economies, gains from efficiency improvements are mobilized to expand the process of production and consumption, which makes absolute reductions very difficult to achieve. In other words, it is not our technology that's the problem. Our technology is quite effective. It is growth that is the issue. So what this means is that if rich nations are to achieve sufficient absolute reductions in resource use, they need to abandon growth as an objective, okay? Now, what about climate? Remember, in order to stay under 1.5 degrees, we need to cut emissions to 0 by 2050. And high-income nations, given their disproportionate share of historical responsibility, must decarbonize much faster than this, achieving 0 by 2030 or 2035, okay? This is a dramatic change in direction from our existing trajectory. So the question becomes, is such rapid decarbonization possible? And the answer is yes, but not if high-income nations continue to pursue growth at the same time. And the reason for this is because growth is coupled to energy demand. Okay, so more growth means more energy demands than would otherwise be the case. And we can see the relationship between growth and energy use in this image here. Okay, GDP and energy consumption indexed. I'm not sure what year this is indexed to. I'm sorry, I'll have to get back to that. So what this means is that this is a problem because more energy demand makes it more difficult and probably impossible to cover that demand with renewable alternatives in the short time that we have left. Politicians know this fact, but they cannot bring themselves to face it. In order to reconcile the assumption of continued growth with the Paris Agreement pledges, they bet heavily on speculative negative emissions schemes to save us. The idea here is that even if we overshoot the Paris emissions targets, that's okay, because we can pull excess carbon back out of the atmosphere later in the century. Now, the problem here is that scientists increasingly reject this assumption as highly dangerous. Without going into much detail, the main problem here is that the technology has not been proven at scale. And if it fails, for whatever reason, we will be locked into a hothouse trajectory that would be impossible to escape. So it's a massive gamble with the future of all of life on Earth, all to defend the assumption of economic growth in the global North. Furthermore, I should mention, by the way, that the main negative emissions technology that is under consideration is known as BECCS, which stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Now, crucially, this would require biofuel plantations, roughly 3 times the size of India, which would be appropriated overwhelmingly from the global South. In other words, this so-called solution, speculative, by the way, relies on the assumption of continued imperial appropriation from the southern landmass. Now, if we scale down our assumptions about negative emissions, the evidence is quite clear that to stay under 1.5 degrees, high-income nations will need to abandon growth as an objective. And if you're interested in learning more about the empirical evidence behind this, we have a sort of comments review that discusses relevant evidence in a recent article published in Nature Energy. So in light of this evidence, we need clearly a fundamentally different approach. The first step is to realize that high-income nations do not need more growth. After a certain level, which high-income nations have long surpassed, the relationship between commodity production and human welfare totally breaks down. What actually matters when it comes to human well-being is what we are producing, right? Are we producing things that people actually need or things that are organized around corporate power? Also, whether people have access to the things they need and how income from production is distributed. That's what counts, okay? In fact, my colleagues have demonstrated empirically that it's possible to meet human needs at a high standard with much less energy and resources than rich countries presently use, and much less commodity production. The key is to scale down less necessary forms of production while organizing the economy around human well-being rather than around capital accumulation. So this is what is known as degrowth. Degrowth calls for a planned reduction of excess resource and energy use in high-income nations to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way. So what does this look like in practice? Very simply, instead of assuming that every sector of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need it, we should decide what sectors of the economy we actually need to improve, things like renewable energy deployments, public transportation, healthcare access, and so on, and what sectors are clearly destructive and should be actively scaled down, things like SUV production, private jets, air travel, fast fashion, industrial beef, advertising, finance, the practice of planned obsolescence, the military-industrial complex, and so on. There are clearly huge chunks of the economy that are organized mostly around corporate power and elite consumption, and we would be better off without them. This approach is powerful, by the way, in terms of climate mitigation, because it would significantly reduce energy use. And this is important because, and this is the crucial fact, the less energy we use, the easier it is to achieve a rapid transition to renewables, fast enough to stay under 1.5 degrees. Okay, so this is a feasible strategy for stopping climate breakdown. This approach would also, needless to say, succeed in bringing resource use down to sustainable levels. Okay. Now, most people would regard these measures as sensible for one obvious sticking point. What about jobs? What about livelihoods? As we scale down unnecessary economic activity, won't that lead to unemployment? Clearly, this is politically untenable. Nobody would agree to such a future. Fortunately, there's a very simple solution, which is simply that as the economy requires less labor, we can shorten the working week and share necessary work more evenly. And the good news is that we know that a shorter working week delivers big improvements in human well-being, health outcomes, gender equality, et cetera, while at the same time dramatically reducing emissions. It also, by the way, happens to be resoundingly popular. We can also roll out a climate job guarantee. Such a program would ensure that anyone can train to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation, building renewable energy capacity, insulating homes, producing local food, and regenerating ecosystems. This would allow us to permanently end unemployment and ensure access to dignified, socially necessary, use value oriented work for all. Okay. At the same time, we need to expand universal public services to ensure that all people have access to the resources they need to live good lives without requiring ever rising incomes in order to do so. And here I mean not just healthcare and education, but also housing, public transportation, clean energy, water, and internet. In other words, we need to decommodify the means of survival, de-enclose the commons. On top of this, we need dramatically to reduce inequality and to distribute income more fairly. And this is absolutely key. People often ask me whether there will be enough income in a degrowth scenario to meet human needs. And the answer to this is yes. Literally, by definition, yes. Income is simply the obverse of the total prices of the stuff that is produced and consumed in the economy. There's always exactly enough income to buy everything that the economy produces. So as long as we are producing what people need, then there will always be, by definition, enough income to buy it, so long as the income is distributed fairly. Distribution is everything here, okay? So we can do this with a living wage or living income policy, or to sort of provide a floor at the bottom, while at the same time taxing the rich to the point where they are quite simply no longer rich. Thomas Piketty has pointed out that this is one of the most powerful climate policies we can deploy. And this may sound radical, of course, but in an era of ecological breakdown, it is irrational and dangerous to devote resources and energy to supporting an over-consuming class. Okay, so taking this approach, in other words, establishing a firm social guarantee and sharing resources more fairly would allow us to ensure decent livelihoods for all, therefore delinking human well-being from economic growth, so that we can pursue radical climate action without anyone getting hurt. This is effectively the bread and butter of a just transition. Okay. Now, I want to emphasize here, as I begin to wrap up, that the demand for degrowth is not just about ecology. Rather, it is rooted in anti-colonial principles. Degrowth scholarship calls for an end to the colonial patterns of appropriation that underpin Northern growth in order to release the South from the grip of extractivism and a future of catastrophic climate breakdown. Southern countries should be free to organize their resources and labor around meeting human needs rather than around servicing Northern growth. Degrowth is, in other words, a demand for decolonization. And it's important to recognize that degrowth scholarship, Frantz Fanon, Gandhi, Julius Nyerere, Thomas Sankara, Berta Cáceres, and so on, people who knew that capitalism in the global north was driving colonization in the global south. And this thinking is reflected clearly today in the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, which was signed in 2010 by thousands of social movements from across the global south, calling on the governments of rich countries to cease their appropriation of the planet's commons, scale down their resource use, and decolonize the atmosphere. The Cochabamba Statement is, to my mind, the single most powerful climate document that has ever been written. And it's much more radical and powerful and coherent than anything in mainstream Western discourse. If you haven't read it yet, I urge you to do so. Social movements in the global south very clearly recognize that ecological breakdown is being driven ultimately by capitalism. They recognize that it has clear imperial, they call for an anti-colonial struggle in response. It is incumbent on all of us to stand in solidarity with these demands. So as the 21st century unfolds, we must strive for a world where everyone can live healthy, dignified lives in balance with the planet's ecosystems. This requires a radical convergence in the global economy. Resource use in the global north needs to decline dramatically to get back to sustainable levels, while resources in the south must be reclaimed for meeting human needs, converging at a level that is consistent with universal human welfare and ecological stability. Okay. Now, a few thoughts briefly on how we might get there. Now, scholarship in degrowth faces a bit of a conundrum. We know that it is possible for rich nations to scale down resource and energy use while improving social outcomes. But why would they voluntarily make such a transition when they benefit so prodigiously from the status quo? Of course, we might hope that enlightened leaders will take steps to bring their economies into line with ecological objectives, or that social movements, such as environmentalists united with labor movements, will eventually be able to force them to do so. But why should the global south wait around for this to happen? Why should they wait around to be decolonized? And indeed, why should they wait around for the imperialist structure of the world economy to wither away and allow them a path to development? There are countries of the steps to achieve unilateral decolonization, delinking from exploitation by Northern capital, by mobilizing their resources and labor to meet domestic human needs rather than to service the interests of Northern growth. This is not easy to achieve, but insights from modern monetary theory offer pathways for how it can be done, at least in the case of nations that have sovereign control over their currency. The first step is to reduce dependence on Northern imports. The biggest import categories are food and energy. Governments can issue the national currency to fund a strategy of food sovereignty by mobilizing land through regenerative agroecology to provide nutritious food for all, while at the same time pursuing a strategy of energy sovereignty by rolling out renewables. This would significantly reduce government's need for foreign currency and thus reduce reliance on Northern capital, which is what puts countries in a position where they are forced to accept structural adjustment programs. To mobilize labor for these projects, governments can issue currency to fund a public job guarantee. This would effectively end unemployment and ensure that everyone has access to a decent livelihood in the global south. The third step here is to build sovereign industrial capacity using tariffs and subsidies where necessary in order to organize production around meeting domestic needs to further reduce the pressure for imports and to participate in regional trade, which tends to be much less exploitative. Okay. Now, to the extent that any of these policies are prohibited by foreign creditors, which is quite often the case, governments can and should take steps to default on external debts. This might make borrowing in foreign currency more difficult for a time, but because we are reducing our dependence on foreign currency, this doesn't matter as much as it otherwise might. And by the way, this is made even more possible if debt default is done by several countries in the global south at once. So Sankara's idea of united debt resistance. Taking these steps would reduce the possibilities for plunder by imperialist countries. It would make resources and labor more expensive, and in so doing would effectively force the global north to pursue a transition to post-growth, post-capitalist economics, scaling down excess consumption among the rich while finding ways to meet people's needs with lower levels of resource use. In other words, by decommodifying the social sector. Of course, this approach raises questions about serious headwinds. Many governments in the global south are captured by capitalist interests, and the radical quorum that we had in the 1960s and 1970s has been all but destroyed. So the anti-colonial movement must be rebuilt, and this is happening right now through grassroots social movements across the global south. So the degrowth movements in the global north and environmentalists more broadly need to take this dynamic seriously and align with these struggles for decolonization, and furthermore make every effort to defend them when they come under pressure and attack from imperialist powers, as quite often happens. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I look forward to the discussion from Fede and the rest of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason, for this rich and inspiring talk. I think we have got a lot to discuss. But before we start the open discussion, Federico Demaria will comment on Jason's talk. He is an ecological economist at the Universidad de Barcelona, and his main research interest is to understand the relationship between the environment and the economy. Especially, he is interested in the ecological macroeconomics. Together with Giorgio Callis, Susan Paulson, and Giacomo D'Alisa, he recently published the book The Case for Degrowth, and in 2019, together with Kotari, Saleh, Escobar, and Costa, he published the book Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, which also, I guess, will be or is published in Spanish, Portuguese, German, Italian, and Chinese. Okay, Federico, we are very excited about your comment on Jason's talk, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. And obviously it is difficult to come after Jason, no? When I listen or when I read Jason Hickel, I always have that feeling, I think you say in English, of eureka, no? The kind of things that you say, yes, that is exactly what I think, but he said it better, no? So if there was a reincarnation, I wouldn't mind being Jason Hickel in my next life, no? So to say. I think Jason is an incredible scholar, no? Because he can cover different important topics, no? From inequalities to climate change. He can use as a researcher qualitative and quantitative methods. Analytically, he is super strong, but he is this incredible ability of communicating, no? So sometimes I get this feeling that I could retire, in fact, and my main contribution to degrowth and transformation debate would have been, I think, to introduce degrowth to Yorgos Kallis, who then introduced it to Jason Hickel. And since Jason is on board now, I can retire because he will do the job, no? Now, apart from the jokes, what I would like to ask Jason is, how did you get into degrowth? Because I think this is an interesting question for all of us, and I would like to ask it to all the participants. Having said that, I think we could also apologize with Jason, no? Because the session of today could be seen as a bad joke, no? Like two white men talking about the coloniality. But I think obviously this seminar has to be seen in context with the whole week, in which there are not only us, but many other people. But at least I think it's always good to recognize explicitly our positionalities and weaknesses and limitations. I want to first do so to say, to add a footnote to what Jason said on capitalism, and then try to frame degrowth also in larger debates on alternatives to development, and maybe link it also to the other event that this institute organized on the so-called Latin American Week with intervention of people like Tatiana Roa. I agree with Jason absolutely that capitalism is about what he said, imperialism, appropriation, and colonization. In particular, I would say, referring to William Kapp, one of the proto-ecological economists, that capitalism is a system based on unpaid costs, no? And obviously there is the appropriation of inputs, no? Like Jason explained, in terms of labor and natural resources. And this, in Marxist term, could be seen as what David Hervey calls accumulation by dispossession, no? In which there is an appropriation of some resources without actually paying for the cost. With my colleague Giacomo D'Alisa, we have been suggesting that there is another strategies for capital accumulation, which is the one of capital accumulation by cost shifting, no? In the sense that if you think of care work, no, from feminist analysis, obviously capitalism is not paying for this care work that is done unproportionately by women in general, and it is also not paying for contamination, for example, no, for the CO2 emission that we emit into the atmosphere. Therefore, my argument there would be that capitalism is not only trying to lower the cost of inputs, for example, of labor and natural resources, but is also trying to lower the cost of output. Because, for instance, the global north countries that have been emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, they have not paid for this. And this is very much part of how capitalism works. So in this sense, it's a footnote in the sense that there is not only an appropriation or a lowering of the cost of input, but also of the output, no, of what comes out of capitalism in terms of waste. And I think it could be interesting to distinguish these two different dynamics, in which one, you are appropriating resources, and on the other end, you are shifting the cost. And I think the two are a little bit different, but the mobilization that we see in terms of environmental justice movement, for example, I think is linked to both. Obviously, as Jason was pointing at the end of this talk, referring to development, I think we can understand the history of development as an history of colonization, no? And in terms of what has been done by international economic organization and so on and so forth. And one of the questions in the table is, for example, whether the Sustainable Development Goals framework has something good or is completely has to be rejected. And to be rejected just because of goal number 8, which calls for sustained economic growth, or it has to be rejected because it has no historical understandings of the problems that we are facing today, gender inequalities, economic inequalities, so on and so forth. So it does not recognize this colonization, or it has to be rejected because it is a universal perspective, which has to be questioned just because of that. This is a question that I could raise also to Jason, what he thinks about Sustainable Development Goals and whether we should reject them completely or accept them. Because obviously there are many people who look at this perspective as something interesting or potentially able to promote emancipation. As we discussed already with Tatiana Roa, I think, according to Arturo Escobar, there is a history of the conceptualization of development in social sciences, from modernization theory, which really created this idea of development as economic growth. And then a set of critiques came, no? Materialist or Marxist or anti-imperialist critiques, then cultural critiques, for example, from post-structuralism, then ecological critiques, and of course, Jason has covered this very well. My question, theoretically speaking, is whether we have entered into a new phase in which we are merging all these critiques together and we are calling for alternatives to development, rejecting development as such. In this sense, my question is a very theoretical question, would be, what would be the social theory behind this new phase in which we have entered, which I would call the phase of the pluriverse? Is it the colonial feminism? Is it political ecology? Is it degrowth as a new scientific paradigm? We are probably not yet there. This is something I think open for the debate. In terms of degrowth, I see degrowth as one among many other alternatives to development. We are not proposing degrowth for the global south. degrowth was born in the global north and it applies to it. However, it is relevant to ask, how is degrowth relevant for the global south? I think the question of economic growth is relevant for all countries in the world. I think, as Arturo Escobar has pointed out many times, we should avoid the temptation to say that the global north should degrow while the global south should grow. I think we should open up our minds for different perspectives for the global south. Another concern in these debates on degrowth and the global north and south is what would be the consequences, for instance, economic consequences of the for the global south for degrowth taking place in the global north. For instance, some people would say, well, if the global north would not be buying products from the global south, what would happen to their economies and so on? These, I think, are interesting questions for the debate. And to conclude my intervention, which wants to be short, I want to propose some questions for a kind of a future research agenda. These are not necessarily questions for Jason, are questions for all of us. First is, can we redefine development? Some people should say, yes, it's true, development has been defined by the mainstream as economic growth, and this is problematic, and therefore I think we should reject it. But some other people say we should redefine it, for example, in qualitative terms. I think this is not possible because the definition of development is established by the mainstream, not by critical scholars like us, but I'm open to debate. Second is, when we talk about alternatives to development, what do we actually mean by this? What is an alternative to development? Why is degrowth an alternative to development? In our book, Pluriverse, we propose a set of characteristics that would define what an alternative to development is. First, that it would attempt to transform the structural roots of the problems that we have, something that the SDGs, for example, don't do. Second, that would question the core assumption of the development discourse. And this includes growth, material progress, instrumental rationality, the centrality of markets and economy, universality, modernity, binaries, etc., etc. And the third characteristic of an alternative to development would be that it encompasses a radical different set of ethics and values, no, to those underpinning the current system. And this would include, for example, but we would have to debate it, things like diversity, solidarity, commons, interconnecting, simplicity, inclusiveness, equity, non-hierarchy, etc., etc. The other question would be, what are the differences and similarities among different alternatives to development? For instance, if you look at the ones, for example, like Buen Vivir from Latin America, I think it's much stronger on the cultural critique than degrowth in itself. Therefore, in the differences, we can see also what we can learn from each other. The other question would be, what can we learn from the pluriverse in practice, no? From those alternatives that are currently being practiced, like by the Zapatistas or the Kurds in Rojava. How can we study them, and how can we learn from this pluriverse in practice? The other question would be how to deal with the problems of differentiated populations with different interests, and of the risk of essentializing cultural alternatives, which I think is always there. And then in terms of a global alliance of a political strategies, how can we promote convergences and alliances among different alternatives? No? For instance, what potential for tensions and complementarity is there among these alternatives to development at the local, national, regional, or global level? And then the last question, which is almost a critique to myself and not so much to Jason's, but is the issue of how do we deal with the contradictions within and among these alternatives to development? For instance, I'm referring here to the issue of pluriversality and universality. For instance, how can we deal with those words that do not want to relate with others? For example, the ethno-nationalist and imperializing words. I'm thinking here of extreme right-wing movement. And how can we do this without going against the pluriverse, the principles of the pluriverse? Is it possible to do so without resorting to universal criteria? And I'm saying this because in the book Pluriverse, we say that we outline a set of universal ethical criteria to define what the different alternatives to development are. But these call for a universal set of criteria enters into contradiction with our rejection of the universe, of development as a universal proposal, and the call for a pluriverse, no, for this diversity of alternatives. I think these are some of the questions that are there on the table when we discuss degrowth and trying to put it into context of what is emerging, I think, in terms of alternatives to development from all over the world. And thanks a lot to Jason and the organizer. My intervention was really just a small footnote. Thanks.
Thank you, Federico. It was much more than a small footnote. So Jason, would you like to react to answer to this very rich and complex comment from Federico?
Yeah, first of all, Fede, thank you so much for your comments and also for your research more broadly. I think it's safe to say that I wouldn't be here talking about degrowth was it not for your work and your contributions. So, and the Pluriverse book is excellent, by the way, and I encourage you all to take a look. It's a very rich resource that platforms voices from across the world, specifically the Global South. So just to respond to some of your thoughts here, because they're very rich. First, on the question of the SDGs. Look, I think that we have to understand that the SDGs are an artifact of a political process characterized by bargaining imbalance between the Global North and the Global South in the negotiations at the UN themselves, right? So we know that Global South negotiating teams were pushing hard for much more radical objectives and changes and policies in the SDG process, including, by the way, abandoning growth as an objective, which was heavily watered down and replaced, in fact, with a standalone goal on GDP growth, including in high-income nations, which itself basically nullifies the ecological objectives that the SDGs purport to achieve. And so there's a contradiction at the core of the SDGs, which is materialization of the kind of power struggle between the Global North and Global South, which has come out in the Global North's favor. Okay, so negotiating teams in the Global South are not ignorant of the fact that catch-up developments, that human development in general is not meaningfully possible within an imperialist world economy, and they actively called for a transformation of that system. And yet, of course, that was watered down, diluted, and ultimately denied. So we just have to be, like when discussing the SDGs, we have to be aware of that fact, right? And either insist on a more democratic process that replaces them, or just critique them, and so that it's clear to everyone what's wrong. Okay. To the question of should the Global South grow? Obviously, just so that everyone's clear, degrowth is a set of demands targeted at Global North countries, right? Not at Global South countries. But of course, there are several scholars in the Global South that have said, look, you know, the assumption should not be that we too should pursue capitalist growth. That is also problematic on our own terms, okay? And I think there's some interesting things to be aware of here. The first is that, look, in the existing structure of the world economy, growth in the Global North, as I described, requires cheapening labor and resources in the Global South, okay? To the extent that Global South countries want to improve the lot of their domestic population, improve wages and so on, this leaves them in a very serious conundrum. Because as long as they are capitalists, they will basically have to do the same thing. Okay, they'll have to find some external periphery, as it were, a kind of sub-imperial periphery, to exploit in order to maintain the possibility for capital accumulation. And that's particularly true in cases where they're also being exploited by the Global North, right? And this is why we see that in the Global North, when working class movements make demands for social improvements, while the state and capital may resist, they also are willing to give concessions while maintaining the prospects for accumulation because they have a third party to exploit, okay? In the global south, this is typically not an option. And this is one of the reasons why we see that social movements' demands in the global south for better wages and conditions are generally met by capitalist states, not with concessions, but with violence, right? So the violence that we see playing out in, say, Colombia against labor movements and so on, and the routine assassination of environmental defenders and labor union organizers is an effect of the fact that, given that profits are so constrained in the global south, the only way to maintain accumulation is to brutally suppress your own working class, okay? So if you want to escape, that lot, this is going to require more than just degrowth in the north. It's going to require also a shift in economic paradigm in the south, away from capitalist growthism towards something like anti-imperialist eco-socialism, right? I really increasingly think that the only plausible trajectory for the global south to achieve meaningful developments is some kind of eco-socialist paradigm, right? Effectively, what I mean by that is you must abandon the objective of capital accumulation altogether in order to be able to concede to demands from your working class for improved conditions, in order to allow your working class to make a stronger claim on your domestic resource base, okay? So development in the South is going to require not only anti-imperialism, but also eco-socialist transition. And I think that's important to understand, right? So growth as usual on two fronts is not going to solve the problem in the South. To me, this is the main takeaway from that critique, okay? So this question about, which comes up a lot actually, if you have degrowth in the global north, will this have negative economic consequences on the global south? And in fact, many people will say, given the fact that it might, okay, given the fact that we know the global south relies on exports to the global north, if you reduce demand in the global north, then you reduce these exports, and what are they going to do, okay? Given that fact, several prominent commentators, including people like Ezra Klein, have claims that we should not pursue degrowth in the north for fear that it might harm the south, right? As if the north has ever cared a whittle about what happens to the south. This is extraordinary. And it's absurd, right? Because effectively they're saying the global south must remain in a position of exploitation for their own good. They must remain in a position where they render their land and resources and labor for northern growthism for their own good. This is an extraordinarily colonialist mindset that mirrors almost exactly, in fact, I would say exactly mirrors the discourse of actual colonial agents in the 20th century, who explicitly thought of the colonial project as in the benefit of the global south. That's the way they defended it, no? This is a repetition of that from the heights of the New York Times. So we must be aware of this. So no, there's a better way to think about it, right? And Vandana Shiva was the one who first framed this nicely for me. She pointed out that, look, every unit of labor and resources that the South net exports to the North is a labor of unit and resources they cannot use to meet their own needs, right? Every cabbage they export to Belgium is a cabbage they cannot eat, no? So when we see these net flows from south to north, this is a net drain on the capacity for use value, for meeting use values and human development. Now, we must note that the only way that the South can actually make use of those resources in a meaningful way is if they have the rights to issue their own currency and mobilize labor and resources around domestic objectives, okay? Which at present they do not, under conditions of structural adjustment and conditions of monetary austerity imposed by creditors, okay? So yes, I agree with Ezra Klein in this respect. In the existing structure of the world economy, a degrowth in the North would be bad for the South. But we are not calling for a perpetuation of the existing structure of the world economy. We are calling for its change. Remove the policies that sustain the inability of the South to mobilize resources and labor around meeting domestic needs, allow them to achieve economic sovereignty, which, by the way, has been their demand for several hundred years. And that is the solution, not to maintain them in a position of sweatshop producers for northern growthism. We must be smarter than that. Just briefly to the question of, can development be redefined? I'm sort of agnostic on this question. I mean, yes, I mean, if we were able to produce enough scholarship and enough commentary to redefine development as not about growth, but rather about meeting human needs, then sure. And of course, this is actually, we do see this tendency in progressive global South circles, redefining development in this way. And so I support that. I'm agnostic on whether or not it should be a different term altogether, or you know, is it irredeemable, or can it be changed? I don't know. What I do know is this: what is imperative is that when we talk about decoloniality, when we talk about, you know, people talk about decolonizing curriculums and universities and so on in the global North, this to me is not adequate in and of itself. It must be an active anti-colonial struggle, right? So decolonization is not a metaphor, to quote a famous paper on this. It must be a real struggle for real territory and resources and energy and labor. And what that means concretely is that instead of asking your professors to, quote, decolonize syllabuses, you need to be organizing actively to align with the demands of anti-colonial social movements in the global South, platform their voices, platform their texts, ensure that those voices are foregrounded in international negotiations, and that we promote their perspective and demands at every opportunity. Because, and I can't repeat this enough, their analysis of our ecological crisis is much more robust, much more analytically robust than anything that passes for analysis in conventional global North circles. In the global North, we tend to see the crisis as a problem of technology. In the global South, they recognize that it is a problem of capitalism and imperialist appropriation. So there's much to learn. I will leave it at that.
So thank you very much to both of you, Federico and Jason.